Namaskar and welcome to Public Forum. I am Charu Karthike. The Right to Education Act 2009 has completed 4 years of enactment and 3 years of implementation. In this period, there has been some progress as far as educational infrastructure in the country is concerned. But right now, even as the Act completes 4 years, or rather 3 years of implementation, the opinion continues to be divided as to how much has the country achieved as far as the various deficiencies in our education sector is concerned. In this edition of Public Forum, over the next course of the next 1 hour, I'll be trying to find out what have been the various achievements in the last 3 years and what are the challenges that still remain to be met as far as the Right to Education Act is concerned. So all of that and much more in this edition of Public Forum. I have a fantastic panel of experts with me in the studio today to try to better understand what have been the achievements of the Right to Education Act and what are the challenges that still lie ahead. In the studio with me today, Urmila Sarkar, Chief of Education, UNICEF India. Urmila, welcome to Public Forum.
Hello.
Amit Kaushik, well-known educationist, Managing Director with EduComp and also formerly with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. Amit, thank you so much for coming here. And right here with me, Urmi Goswami, Special Correspondent with Economic Times. Urmi, welcome to Public Forum.
Thank you.
Urmila, first of all, I would like to begin with you. As the Act completes its 3rd anniversary, there has been a lot of assessment and it is coming out daily, even on television, in newspapers. The opinion clearly is divided. While a lot of people are praising the progress that has been made, some are saying that much more remains to be done, while there are certain others who are saying that absolutely nothing has been achieved and this Act has been a sham, a hoax. Your take on 3 years of RTE?
I think, well, I remember being on this show 3 years ago, and actually every year, and it's great that you do this show to review where we are in terms of right to education. And I would say it's both, we have seen progress, but I would also say there is quite a bit to do to achieve many of the targets set under the Act. In terms of progress, anyway, India has made enormous progress universalizing access to primary education, which we've discussed in the past, even on this show and other forums in the last 10 years. And in the last 3 years, during the time of RTE implementation, we've seen 11 more million children enrolled in the schools. We've seen millions of post-sanctions for teachers. We've seen substantial structural reform in teacher education. The budget of SSA has increased by double in the years that the right to education, or the budget for education sector allocation has increased by double in the since the right to education has been enacted. So these are all signs of hope or progress. But at the same time, that's alongside how much remains to be done. Because what we see is there's still millions of children, there's still 8 million children out of school, and all those children need to be mainstreamed into age-appropriate class under the Act, which is a huge challenge for many state governments. There's still about 80 million children that are not able to complete the full cycle of elementary education. That number has not come down as much as we would have liked in the last 3 years. We see classrooms across the country still characterized by rote learning, by discrimination in the classroom, and by more a teacher-centered method instead of the kind of child-centered and participatory learning approach that is called for by the Act. There's still quite a bit of work to do in terms of ensuring that the community has ownership of the schools and that we have school management committees that are functional, because this is very critical to ensuring right to education compliance. But I would still end on a sign of hope that there's still quite a bit of resources to expend on education. And what I think would be critical is that state governments with civil society take stock of what needs to be done. So yes, I've seen in the reports in the media, there is pessimism around the Act, but I would say it's actually a call for hope, a call to action, to say with an urgency that how much can we fulfill in terms of those RT commitments as quickly as possible. Okay,
that's quite a positive interpretation of all that has been coming out. Amit, the 3 years, the deadline of 3 years was for infrastructure and certain other provisions laid down by the RTE. First of all, how do you take a look, how do you look at these provisions which were talked about as far as this compliance period of 3 years is concerned?
Well, I think the Act made it quite clear that at least in terms of the basic norms of making sure that there were adequate classrooms, adequate teachers, properly trained teachers, and so on, that a 3-year window was at that time considered adequate to complete the gaps that were missing. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that the state governments are increasingly of the view that this is not a timeline that they're going to be able to meet. We have seen newspaper reports where the Delhi government, for example, the Chief Minister has assured all the so-called unrecognized private schools that the deadline will not be implemented and that they need not fear being penalized and so on. And I saw another report somewhere in one of the newspapers that some 16 states have written to the Ministry of HRD seeking exemptions from various provisions of the Act. What that seems to point to is that perhaps there was some underestimation at the time the Act was passed about the scale of the task, perhaps.
Okay.
And yes, I agree with Urmila. We've done rather well on the access front, and there certainly have been many more schools available to children. Both, I would hasten to add, in the public as well as the private space. And as a result, there are far more children who are currently enrolled in school. I'm not quite so sure about whether they're actually attending school or not, but they are definitely enrolled in school. In fact, if you look at the last ASER report, it says that while all this has happened, all this provisioning has happened,
Learning outcomes.
I'm not going to learning outcomes this
Okay.
time.
Okay.
The attendance of teachers and children in school has actually fallen this year. So clearly then there is a mismatch between the provisioning and the availability of all the teachers and their actual attendance and performance in class. So I think when you look at these kinds of things, perhaps we have underestimated the scale of what needs to be done to some extent. And I agree with Urmila that there is a lot more that needs to be done. The last thing I would say is on this particular aspect of the Act is that I had the great good fortune of being in a position where I got to work with people who were actually creating this historic piece of legislation. And among the many discussions that took place in those days, one was that this would only be the first of many acts that would follow,
Okay.
which would address different types of problems that exist in the school space or in the education space.
Okay.
What we have seen now is that the entire discussion has centered around this one act that is 3 years old, to the complete exclusion of any other form of legislation or regulation or even policy guideline that could perhaps guide the other aspects that have been left out of consideration here.
That's a fair point. Urmi, this failure by various schools across the country to comply with the provisions laid down in the deadline of 3 years, this could be looked upon as one, as Amit says, an underestimation of the time that actually you would have taken. But there is also another way to look at it, which some people have been pointing out, that this shows a lack of political will, which political leadership must be accountable for as the laws laid down, because it makes education an entitlement. It makes good infrastructure an entitlement. It makes adequate space in school an entitlement. And if the government has not been able to guarantee that parents and children receive this, then the government must be held accountable. What does it mean to you? An underestimation or a lack of political will?
Actually no one factor. Yes, there is an underestimation,
Yeah, that's probably
and there is also a lack of political will. There's also this very typically Indian mindset. You make a law and then as if the law, the law is there and your problems are gone. The law is just an enabler. This law was to help enable children between the ages of 6 and 14 to actually access their fundamental right. So now that the law is in place, you have to implement it, and that is where the problem arises. So yes, it's all of the above. There's also the additional thing, which is a question of events that we now obviously seem to have forgotten, is that though the Act was enforced from 1st April 2010, it effectively started, actually serious work started only a year later, because the law was taken to, it was challenged in the Supreme Court. So should the government have gone back and asked for an extension? Should it have sought to amend the law for a further, for a relaxation of the target deadline? There's a divided house on that. So it's a lot of mismanagement in terms of time, in terms of how you plan your targets, and also you have to plan your implementation properly. The lack of will. is there. I mean, the very fact that it took us 60 years to actually make education, basic education, a fundamental right should tell us something about how we prioritize basic education. Just because we have been talking about it for the last 15 years, and no matter how routine the conversation has become, one is happy that the conversation is on, because you are talking, we are at least talking about it as an issue. But the fact is that it took us 60 years to wake up and make something out of it. Actually, maybe a little less than 60 years, because in 1996 you had the only Christian case, but still it took you so long.
Urmila, the larger question behind missing this deadline is, I mean, the deadline can be missed, fine, no problem. You can be given another year of extension, you can be given 2 more years of extension, you can be given 3 more years of extension. But taking a look at the state of infrastructure right now across the country, do you think another 2 years or another 3 years would have made any difference, of a very significant difference? We can approach this question another way also. How much actually has been the progress achieved only as far as infrastructure is concerned in the last 3 years?
Right. I mean, in terms of infrastructure, actually, when you look at official data, actually from various sources, you find quite a bit of progress on separate toilets, for example, for girls and boys, and access to drinking water and water facilities in general, which is interesting, because that's also in line with the Supreme Court judgment, which was there on toilets. I think that also helped. And that was interesting, because at UNICEF we've actually been doing our own stock taking and looking at the data. What we found at the same time in terms of infrastructure is some states are really lagging behind in ensuring a library in every school, in ensuring the proper teaching, learning material, and in some of the other aspects, boundary wall, ramps. These actually are quite low when you look at the national averages. That's in terms of infrastructure. But when we go back to the question of, would it have made a difference to have 2 more years? I mean, that goes back to the political will that Urmi was mentioning, because whether you have 2 years, 5 years, it is about political will ultimately. I think anything is possible if you have the political will behind you. But on top of that, you need to have a very methodical approach to dealing with it. So you need political will, but also a very methodical and systematic approach, particularly by state government with civil society. But then I would agree with Amit's point about the timing issue, the adequate timing. So I think what's critical now is that states really take stock, really discuss, the government, the civil society, the media, where are we in terms of RTE, and then make realistic assessments of what can be done. And there are quick wins that can be, there are certain one-time investments, like ensuring a library that's used by teachers
Can
and
you put a
children.
number to when you talk about the performance of the states, which states have been doing well, or rather how many approximately have been doing well and how many have not?
When we look overall, like in terms of the state for drinking water facilities, toilets for girls and boys, actually across the board, the average is pretty good. We have it at about 70–80%, something like that. But that's not to look at individual states, but generally the averages are pretty good.
Okay.
And actually, and on the different site, we have actually put the specific data. But there are some states, 4 or 5 states in particular, Bihar and others, where you see it's not doing very well in terms of library, in terms of ramps, and if you're looking at children with special needs, where there's still a lot of work to do. But the last point I would make is that there are certain one-time investments that can be made that would make a big difference in terms of achieving the right to education targets. And even sanctioning the posts for teachers, all of that, you see an improved pupil-teacher ratio. You see that, even though the target for teachers is not till 2015. We have to point that out. It's still another 2 years to go when we're looking at training of teachers. But going back to Amit's point about timing, that the state governments, they need to be where, how long will it take to ensure pedagogical transformation? When we're looking at child-friendly, child-centered classrooms, free of discrimination, free of fear, that kind of work on quality, that needs to be much more seriously taken into an account. What time is needed? And some of these are long-term, because it's really about strengthening institutions and governance and teacher education that can't be done overnight. And that's where the timing issue becomes important.
But quality is something which is missing from the debate right now. It is on nobody's mind. Even the assessments, even the assessors of the so-called of the progress or achieved or the task that is yet to be done. The quality seems to be missing in all of that debate. But as far as the infrastructure part is concerned, there are a lot of states who had, even when RTE was being implemented, they had raised their hands and they had surrendered, in effect, asking the central government for more financial assistance, because they said that they simply do not have the kind of resources that are required to implement or to take care of the enabling provisions for which this 3-year deadline just expired. What has been the progress as far as the funds allocated for the education sector is concerned? All of that and much more on the other side of this very short break that we are slipping into. Stay tuned to Public Forum. Welcome back. You're watching Public Forum, and today we are talking about 3 years of implementation of the Right to Education Act. Amit, we remember when the Right to Education was enacted, several states, the leading ones probably being Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, had completely surrendered, and they said that we just do not have the resources to implement the provisions that we are asking, that you're asking us to do. And at the end of the day, they had probably predicted this situation, that when this deadline expires, we are going to be held accountable for not having done much, whereas the truth is we do not have enough resources to do it. How do things stand right now as far as the finances to cover this sort of provisions are concerned?
Well, I think what we have seen in the last few years has been a significant increase in the resources generally available for school education across the board. I mean, it's not just the central government; it's also the state governments. The degree to which each state government has been able to contribute, of course, has differed from state to state. But as a result, what we're looking at today is something like, if I remember the Paisa report which came out recently correctly, 11,000 odd rupees per child per annum is the national average, right? So this varies from 15,000 or 16,000 rupees in some states down to maybe 7 or 8,000 rupees in some states. Okay. Now this is a number which has increased very significantly from what it used to be. Okay. In 2005 and 2006, when this act was actually being debated and when it was being drafted, at that stage, if I remember correctly, the figures were about 3,000 odd rupees per child per annum. So you're talking about an increase of almost 8,000 rupees per child per annum in the space of about 5 years or so. That is a significant increase. But that said, I'm associated with the group that runs private schools. And our costs of running a good high quality private school are almost about 10 times as much. Now, what you said before the break, the issue of quality is one that is somehow being left out of this entire debate. And we've seen endless numbers of reports from independent groups, from the government themselves, showing that children are not learning despite all this money that is being spent. Where does this leave us? Is this act, the question I have today is this act actually enough, or should we be looking at what else can civil society do? I take Urmila's point, the point she made about the need for civil society, government agencies, for NGOs and everybody to sit together, take stock of where we stand and decide what else needs to be done. I think we need to widen the debate and go beyond the Right to Education Act itself and look at what other things need to happen. Yes, education must, free and compulsory education must be a right for all children in this country. About that there can be no doubt at all. Yes, government has the role and the responsibility of ensuring that such education is made available to such children. But does government have to be delivering this education is a question that we, I think, need to start asking now. Government used to be in the business of making scooters, look where that went. Government used to be in the business of making bread, look where that went. Government is still in the business of running the airlines, and look what's happening there. I think, and I'm not, let me make it clear that I'm not advocating a drastic shift in how we look at education or a completely revolutionary change of philosophy. I'm not. All I am saying is that there is the space for a lot more players than only government, and if the fact that it is only government or largely government who is the service provider in this case is holding up progress, then it's time we take a very hard look at where we are and look at what might be other options.
Okay. Urmi, your assessment of the funding part of it, has the funding in the last 3 years gone up significantly, both central allocation and states allocation?
Okay. Let me just make one statement before I move to funding, because the funding question is very simple. You look at the budget papers and you know that funding has gone up. I mean, there are no two ways about it. Of course, you must also remember that a 2% cess has been put on all people who pay any kind of tax, direct and indirect, from 2004, and that cess now accounts for 60% of the funding for the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is the vehicle through which the RTE is being implemented.
Okay.
But that apart, I think it is time we understand one thing: quality and the issue of who is running the show is they're mutually exclusive questions actually. Quality is also sometimes about doing things right within the same amount of outlay or with a little imagination. Let me give you a small example. A week ahead of the 31st March deadline, the Ministry of Human Resource Development gave a relaxation to 13 states, which includes UP, Bihar, West Bengal,
Okay.
on the issue of teachers. Now, the deadline, 31st March deadline, was for the pupil teacher ratio. They didn't have enough teachers. There's an 11 lakh shortage
Yeah.
of teachers. So the relaxation was given that you can take in untrained teachers, and over the next 2 years, that's 2015 is the deadline for training. You train these
them.
people.
Yeah.
Now this is a matter of imagination. This should have struck the central government or the state government much before. We didn't have to come to a crisis situation, on 21st of March or 15th of March and say, oh, let's give this relaxation. Imagination. Do you really need a very highly trained teacher if you're teaching classes 1 and 2? Can you not manage, given the situation that in the ideal world everybody should be trained? We don't live in an ideal world, we live in an actually resource scarce world. So we should stop pretending that we live in a world where we have all these people begging to be teachers. We don't. We also live in a country which has about 82 districts now classified as left-wing extremist affected districts. You are not going to get anybody to go there for love or for money. Definitely not for love. I don't know about, definitely also not for money. So therefore, you have to find ways to beat the system. How do I beat the system? I find somebody maybe there who has made it till class 8 or class 9. I get her to teach in classes 1 and 2, and it is happening. So you have to show imagination. Quality is about imagination, interest. It is also about money. It is also about resources. I have consistently maintained that...
Would you say that the RT is responsible for sort of firing this imagination?
Imagination doesn't come easy to us. And I don't think it's the RT. It's just us. We don't seem to have an imagination. Now, like, we are always caught up on this question of quality. I love to, I'm told quality means trained teachers. I want to know what these trained teachers means. Where are we going? Do I want kids... What do I want my kids to go to school for? So that they have hope, so that they can be the best they can be. If I'm not giving that to them, or if they're learning nothing for reasons that have nothing to do, for no fault of their own, there is a problem. So I think finances is one thing. Yes, we should be looking at finances, but the education sector gets much less than it deserves. I think it deserves way more. We are, at 3.7% of GDP? In 1966, the Kothari Commission said 6%. In 2004, UPA 1 said, we'll give you 6% in 5 years' time. 5 years have come and gone, and we are still at 3.7%. So yes, I would like more money. But first, it's like ask anybody who runs a household.
There are changes that can be brought about in the money that you have right now.
It's a matter of attitude.
Yeah, I think throwing more money at the problem is not going to make it go away. I agree with Urmi there.
Right.
There is a need to be more creative and more imaginative in the solutions that you find, and which can be done within the resources that are available.
Right.
Yes. But my limited point is that all imagination and creativity does not lie within government.
Right.
Sometimes it lies
Okay,
outside as well.
I'll come to that subsequently. Urmila, this is a criticism of the RT that keeps coming up repeated regularly. A lot of people talk about it, but unfortunately it's not debated much. A lot of people say that RTE, the essential focus is on infrastructure. I don't know whether it could be the focus. When they say focus, it could be public imagination when they mean focus. But a lot of people say that the focus in RTE is mostly on infrastructure and not on learning outcomes. And as was discussed after Pratham's annual State of Education report, learning outcomes have probably fallen in the last 3 years and not improved. what has RTE contributed to quality, to learning outcomes in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I would completely disagree with the statement that RTE does not address quality, because I think, and I've done work in the past in looking at comparative reviews of compulsory education legislations from other countries in Asia and Europe and the UK, and it is actually one of the few pieces of legislation that I've seen that addresses quality in such a holistic way.
Okay.
So I would totally disagree, and even in looking at the basic parameters of the Act and the Annex, there are important quality indicators on teaching learning materials, on pupil-teacher ratio, and then within the text of the legislation itself, there's a whole section 29 that's devoted to child-centered curriculum. There are a number of provisions around the qualifications of teachers and so forth. I think the issue is more not so much about what's in the legislation and the provisions, but it is a bit about imagination. I would actually agree with that point. And how do we define quality? I mean, it's in the legislation, but the legislation is not the place to be looking for the step-by-step approach to how we're going to transform classrooms. And what I think needs to be done on a very urgent basis is for civil society, state governments to come together and say, how are we going to transform classrooms? And there are ways to do this. There are ways, when we talk about continuous comprehensive assessment in the legislation, it's one of the weakest implemented provisions in the legislation. Has it been looked at seriously enough? Do people understand what it means? Does the teacher understand what it means?
Yeah.
So there,
in fact, I was going to come to that, because you said imagination. I started thinking about CCE.
Do people understand
the various
what it
provisions of
is?
CCE, they seem pretty imaginative to me. But I also see a lot of resentment among the teachers, among the teachers themselves, as far as the CCE is concerned.
And do people understand what CCE means? Do people understand it has to do with individual learning pace, it has to do with milestones for the children? It actually makes it a bit easier if you have children. See, if you're looking at mainstreaming children from out of school that have no foundational literacy, and then they have to catch up to age-appropriate class, then what kind of a strategy are you going to have to do that? CCE is actually a way to integrate the differential learning paces of different children. But does the teacher understand that? Does the community or the parent understand that? So this kind of, I think it's just looking at a very serious and systematic approach to dealing with quality. And then I wanted to just go back to Amit's point about being innovative in partnership, because I think right to education, and I use the example of the School Excellence program in Mumbai, which was stimulated by Right to Education, where the public sector came together with the private sector to address learning outcomes for urban slum children. And it was the municipality of Greater Mumbai, but a number of corporates, NGOs, civil society, and the civil society NGOs that have practical experience in effective teaching and learning process that came together to look at school leadership management and improving learning outcomes. And I've visited the initiative after 2 years of implementation, and we've seen progress. So this is the kind of thing that we see in Mumbai, but we need to see it across the country. I mean, that's the problem.
Okay. Well, on that note, it's time for me to slip into yet another break. But on the other side, there was one more objective that was being talked about when right to education was being debated upon, and that was making education inclusive, bringing under the umbrella of education a lot of people who still did not have access to it. For example, children from economically weaker sections, for example, children with special needs. There have been a lot of beautiful stories throughout the country which show that probably this has been done. But taking a look, but a holistic assessment, how much has that been able, how much country has been able to achieve on that respect? All that and much more on the other side of this short break. Do stay tuned to Public Forum. Welcome back. You're watching Public Forum, and today we're talking about the challenges ahead as far as the Right to Education Act is concerned. Amit, last week we saw a very beautiful report in a national daily about a couple of schools in Mumbai which were there, which had been designed for especially for children with special needs, and now they are celebrating their closure because they say that the act, their objective or the dream that they had been fighting for is the inclusion of children with special needs with regular children in regular schools has been met, and it is the Right to Education Act that has made this dream possible. Has RTE lent an air of accessibility, of inclusion to school education in the country?
I think definitely. The philosophy behind the Act was very clearly one of inclusion. It was one very clearly of making sure that children received what was legitimately due to them. And that meant all children, regardless of birth and where they came from or whether they had physical or other disability, treating all children as equal and making sure that each child has equal access to educational opportunity, which is great. That's the way it should be. But you know, sometimes in this whole discussion about, for example, the story that you mentioned, you know, a school that was running, focusing on children with special needs and how those children have been mainstreamed into private schools, we tend to sort of miss the fact that a lot of private schools have already been doing this for many years. There are a large number of schools in this country who are completely inclusive, and they include children with disabilities, they include children from economically poorer backgrounds, regardless of where they come from. Second, the number of schools that are actually under private management is a very small number, right? The large majority of schools are government schools. My question is, while this was a happy success story with a success story with a happy ending, how many government schools today are actually ready to be inclusive? That is a serious concern. You know, if you go into small villages in, say, rural Madhya Pradesh or rural Uttar Pradesh or rural Bihar, where caste equations still hold sway, you will find that that's not an inclusive classroom at all. And it doesn't matter whether the child is with disability, without disability. That's a classroom where children are treated differently based on which caste background they come from.
And RTE has been able to make no difference to
RTE
that.
cannot make a difference to this because RTE is an act that governs how education is transacted in the country. It does not govern the social order, nor does it have provisions for changing the social order. Let's not forget that in most of these, in the kinds of situations that I'm describing, most of the children who are present in that classroom actually come from socially and economically disadvantaged groups, whereas the teacher very typically will be somebody who's from one of the forward castes, so-called. And that means that these kids and their parents, for example, when we talk about community engagement with the school, these are people who are going to deal with that teacher from a position of disempowerment to start with. Then how are you going to change that and make that an inclusive classroom?
Right.
I think those are the larger concerns that we should be looking at.
Urmi, your take on that?
Yes, inclusive is a nice word, but it's a very complicated and complex situation. And you know, I mean, there's no point in repeating what Amit said because that's really the case. But I think again, certain interventions can be made. These are complexities that exist, and we have to find ways to work around them. And I think one of the problems that the RTE has, and it's not really the problem just with the legislation. It's again a mindset thing. Is that on one hand there's an immense amount of centralization as you know how you look at quality and what you understand are quality parameters, and the other side there is a lot of you know, decentralization in terms of who the final authority is, whether it's the district or the state or the central government. And I think what needs to change is there needs to be more space for each school. So each school, each teacher should be able to define how she or he manages their classroom, or how each headmistress or headmaster manages their school. For the simple reason is that you could have a situation whereby you have a class which is has got more kids from disadvantaged communities and a forward caste teacher, or it could be, you know, a class of, you know, disadvantaged kids and a teacher from a disadvantaged community. How a teacher mediates, you know, learning in her classroom should be left to that, and that is one of the big problems. It's not an RTE problem. Let me be very specific.
Okay.
It's a
social issue.
It's not only a social issue. It's also the way we have sort of understood education and learning. Our learning has over the years become a very textbook focused learning, and no matter how we dress it up, child centric or rote learning or whichever way you go, it revolves around the textbook. Now in some cases it's because of lack of resources, and lack of, I don't mean just in terms of money. Now let's say in a very backward village you give them money for a computer, but there is no electricity. So thank you so much, what do I do with the money for the computer? So you have to allow the teacher that space to make learning interesting for our kids by making it relate to issues that are around. Should the child not learn about computers? Of course not, they should. But do I have to actually, where the computer comes in into their lives and at what point and how is something that I should leave it to the teacher. And I think, though, if I'm not saying that the problems of social inclusion, which is what the issue of inclusion is, will be addressed like that. But I believe that you can mitigate some of the difficulties.
Okay.
You know, because the guy who is there at that spot makes the right assessment. If you're sitting, whether you're sitting in Patna or New Delhi or Lucknow, it's very difficult to make an assessment of what's happening, say, in Begusarai.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
know?
Urmila, the contribution of RTE for promoting inclusive school education.
Well, I think, I mean, again, it's a unique piece of legislation when you look globally for addressing head-on the issues of inclusion and disadvantaged groups within the law.
Which are unique to this country.
Which is unique, not necessarily to India, you see it all over the world, but it's unique that it's in the Right to Education Act. And I would also agree that the act alone, the legislation alone, can't address wider social issues that are embedded in society for so many years. I mean, that's the issue. But at the same time, I've always seen the Right to Education Act as an instrument for transformation. I see it as an instrument for social transformation. But then it can't be, but then to make it happen, I think that's where you require innovation, imagination, and you need to look at examples of what works. So when just hearing Urmi and Amit speaking, I was just thinking, like, what have I seen around the field that works in terms of social inclusion? And one example that many people know and quote is the Loreto School, which is actually a private school where the Sister Cyril used her imagination and came up with the idea that we have all these homeless children, trafficked children, street children. Why don't we bring them into this private school and have middle or upper class students interact with these children? And that kind of social integration improved the overall learning environment of the school. And then we've seen across the country sports and physical education being used as a way of bringing children together from different religious, different caste and class backgrounds, and not only improving quality physical education and sport, but promoting inclusion. So I think that's where we need to be more systematic about it, but we also need to go out of our comfort zone and do something differently. When we look at the out-of-school children today, we often talk about, recently there was a publication put out on the problems for tribal children and quality education and access for tribal children. But when you look, actually the Muslim children have so many issues when you look at the out-of-school. And are the classrooms, are the teachers able to deal with these issues? And so it's about changing the mindset, getting out of the comfort zone, but also looking at practical examples in the field to the show how. So it's in the act, we know that we have to do something about it, but being more systematic from head teacher, from teacher to school administration, and the government officials themselves, and even the private sector, whatever, the different organizations coming together. Are we working with the representative organizations in this case? Are we working with organizations of Dalit people?
Okay.
Are we working with organizations of tribals to address this? I would say not enough.
Okay.
And that's where I think the issue lies.
Okay.
That was just one thing. That,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, because we live in cities and we tend to look at examples of things that are happening, and a lot happens in our cities. It's not that they're not happening, but the real test of the law, sets out the ideal condition, is how it affects those who are at the margins.
Yeah.
And I think that is where the problem lies. We need to be able to reach those kids who are today at the margins, who are in unserved areas, which are in extremely backward districts. That is where, and the solutions that will work there may not be solutions that work in a Loreto convent or even in the slums of Mumbai. What will work there is something where we have to get people, local people involved. And there has to be, I mean, they may not be literate, but I'm sure they're united in one thing, that they want the best for their children.
So is the RT reaching out to them?
Not enough.
Not enough, but that's a problem of implementation. It's not a problem of the law. You know, the law, as Urmila has said several times, that it sets out a lot of interesting details, but it's the ideal condition. We are far from ideal. So actually much more effort needs to be made to implement it, and there comes the issue of political will, interest,
Resources.
well, yeah, some resources. It's imagination, innovation.
Okay.
It's a whole different ball game.
Okay. It's time for me to slip into yet another break. But on the other side of this break, in the final few minutes of this discussion, of course, there are a plethora of aspects that need to be touched upon. But what could be the immediate focus areas on which some change could be set in motion so that the objectives of right to education, we are able to achieve them better and probably in a lesser time as envisaged. So all of that and much more on the other side. Stay tuned to Public Forum. Welcome back. You're watching Public Forum, and today we are talking about the right to education and challenges ahead. Urmila, I'll begin this round with you. As far as the future roadmap for RT is concerned, the immediate focus areas.
I think the immediate focus is it's time to discuss, it's time to take stock, as I said in the beginning. What has been achieved, what are the gaps, and with a focus first on how do we promote inclusive space in the classroom, teachers as agents of change, how do we ensure the school and the community are working together, and finally the most difficult but important part is how do we strengthen institutions and governance to make right to education happen. So I think the focus right now is taking stock and seeing with how how quickly can we actually complete the unfinished right to education commitments.
Okay. Amit?
Well, I think Urmila said it all, so there's really not much that I can add. But what I would say in terms of immediate focus, yes, with everything that she said, I think a much greater focus on teacher training and teacher empowerment, because I think that really will be key to whether this act is successfully implemented or not. And second, I think I would like to see a great deal more use of technology for assisting and facilitating the implementation of the act. From simple things like, and I'm not talking about technology where you have lessons that have been drawn up by somebody sitting in Delhi or New York. Not talking about that. I'm talking about simple things like tracking children's progress, tracking children themselves, tracking the delivery of the midday meal, which has been done, for example, very successfully in Uttar Pradesh, where they're doing it through the mobile phone interactive voice response thing.
Yeah.
That kind of usage of technology, which I think will help to keep track of what's happening, will help you to monitor each rupee as it gets spent.
Which right now is being done through reams and reams of papers and registers.
In some states it's being done through technology, in some states it's being done through reams and reams of papers. But I think it's not about whether technology has been adopted or not, it's about changing the mindset within government to accept large-scale deployment of technology, and I think that is something that probably is missing.
Okay. Urmi?
Well, first order of business, I mean, all should move simultaneously actually. One is taking stock, as Urmila put it, but also looking at what kind of tinkering you have to do. Consider the case of toilets. You have toilets, but there's a problem now about maintenance. There's no accounting for how you ensure maintenance of these toilets. So you go and build the toilets, but maintenance doesn't happen.
Okay.
So within a year's time, it's as good as not having the toilet.
Okay.
So things like that, to make those changes, make up for what
you mean there's no monitoring mechanism to ensure that a toilet once built is properly maintained?
How do you ensure maintenance? Do you have the provisions for maintenance? Is that enough?
Who will maintain it?
Who will maintain it? I mean, presumably the school, but who pays for it?
Okay.
Or how much money is being allocated?
Okay.
That kind of a thing. So
that will be taken care of by the school management committee if
but you have to have,
if there
if
exists
it's
funds.
functioning, if it's there.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's so many ifs and buts. So you make up for, make up on the targets that you have missed. Some of this, and there'll be additional issues that have cropped up over these 3 years while you're meeting all these infrastructure and teacher targets. You will have to tinker around, not in the law, but in the implementation of the law, how you work around it. Do you, as I said about the teacher training, do you really, maybe we don't need trained teachers at class 1 or class 2. Maybe we can do with, teachers who have just finished class 10, 12, that kind of tinkering, that relook. And I'm not suggesting para teachers, but that kind of a relook so that we meet our infrastructure and teacher targets. That's the first order of business, because you need schools and you need teachers to have schooling. Second, and the most important part, I think, is where you empower teachers. And when I mean empower teachers, I mean give them the freedom to do things, to design learning of course to a certain sort of set out curriculum, but design learning so their children, the children in their classroom learn most. And within that, please ensure accountability. Please evaluate your teachers more regularly. So actually, yes, we need a child-centric schooling, but we need a teacher-centric evaluation, where the teacher is evaluated. And the issues of inclusion, quality, these will happen. We'll have to look at it side by side, but first you need a school and a teacher and systems in place, and the teacher needs space so that we can then begin to address those issues. Very often we are talking about a school should have a library. Very good, you have a library, but we don't have enough teachers in the school. So let's not put the cart before the horse.
I often find a lot of teachers complain that their logistics workload has increased after the RT was implemented, after the CCE was brought into place. Can there be done something? Probably the intervention of technology can make a difference to that. But what is that the right approach? Is there some problem in approach when teachers feel that their logistic workload has increased?
I think it's a matter of getting used to. The CCE is a new thing, and one of the areas of failure of the RT, implementation of the RT, because I think not enough has been done to actually lay out what exactly CCE is and how it should be done. So everybody has said, some states say that, like Bihar, they have actually said that continuous and comprehensive evaluation, teachers understand it to mean no examination and no evaluation, which is not the case. Whereas in some schools, maybe in Delhi, it has meant over evaluation and over much more work for the classroom teacher. So you have this whole range of things. There has to be some kind of there has to be a better hand holding on that. You have to work harder at actually explaining what it is, and then within that, whatever variation schools and teachers want to make. But basically there has to be that. And as for the complaint, I think when you transition from one system to another, change is always painful, and I think part of the complaint is about the pain of change. So I think we need to reach out to our teachers to ask them what they think are the problems, and why they feel it's a problem, and perhaps address them. But we will probably see that some of these things are about, when you move away from an annual exam to a weekly exam, the pain of change is great. So some of it could be just painful transition, and some of it could be some real problems. It can be addressed, as Amit said, through technology and other such
Urmila, your assessment also on the technology part of it, as Amit said, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about technology at a time when there's a lot of speculation that probably HRD is moving away from the one technological advancement that it had been talking about in the last 1 year, probably the Akash tablet. Although the HRD minister has categorically, he has gone on record, he has said that the technology minister, the Kapil Sibal, whose brainchild probably it was. But still, there is speculation that HRD ministry is moving away from that emphasis on Akash. But apart from Akash, I mean, that just gives us a background to talk about technology. The potential of technology in making a real impact as far as school education is concerned.
Definitely, there's a huge potential to transform school education through ICT, and in different ways, in professionalization of teacher education and training, but also in terms of quality assurance system, in terms of innovative pedagogy, and really reaching out to some, the northeastern states could really benefit from information communication technology, just in terms of training the teachers. I think that the issue with the Akash tablets is that it's definitely an interesting innovation, but there has to be a planned approach. So I would say that it's important for their public-private partnership to look at a planned approach for where are the gaps and how can we actually realize RT goals through ICT, because there is a huge potential in technology for realizing targets. And it's in terms of quality, but also in terms of monitoring. So you have much stronger quality assurance system. And I think technology, but it's just a tool. So the key is how do you plan it in such a way so that the tool is used correctly? And also, if there are other issues around the culture of technology. So when we go out to the most remote rural areas, do students have the culture of using technology? So these are the kinds of issues that need to be addressed if it's going to be fully realized. And the fact remains still, when you look at a recent UNESCO report has come out, that if you look at access to technology, it's still very difficult for the most deprived or marginalized communities. So that has to be dealt with, the equity and access of technology.
Okay, fantastic. And I mean, that's all I have time for. I would have loved this discussion to go on, but that's all I have time for. Urmila Sarkar, Amit Kaushik, Urmi Goswami, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We do seem to have come a long way as far as last 3 years of implementation of the Act is concerned, but as my panelists consistently argued throughout the last 1 hour, that there is a lot that needs to be done, and there are several areas, some of the immediate focus areas we discussed. It remains to be seen whether some stock taking is truly comes out in the days to come, and what sort of tweaking does really happen to SERF as far as meeting the objectives, the avowed objectives of right to education is concerned. That's all I have time for in this edition of Public Forum. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Do stay tuned to Loksabha television for more. Namaskar.